Okay, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Tim Ojo. It's a pleasure to welcome you to a free member webinar as part of the Royal College of Psychiatrists celebration of Black History Month. We're tackling a very big topic. We've got 1 hour. We have the luxury of 4 eminent speakers who can talk to us about their perspectives on key issues of concern to those of us who are looking for racial justice. Topic of this webinar, as you know, is tackling racism in the workplace. I'm Anton Emmanuel. I'm Associate Registrar of Policy Support at the college. My task today is a very important one, and that's to give our speakers, panelists, the opportunity to share with us their wealth of wisdom and insights into this critical topic. I'm going to introduce them in turn, and I will use an alphabetical order process just to make it balanced. So the first panelist we have is Dr. Rasheedah Bankole, who's a consultant psychiatrist working with Lancashire and South Cumbria NHS Foundation Trust. So welcome, Dr. Bankole.
Thank you.
We also have a very eminent senior colleague of ours in psychiatry, Dr. Aggrey Burke. And citations will not do justice to all he has achieved, but I have in front of me that Dr. Burke was born in Jamaica, schooled in Britain, became a doctor, having gone through Birmingham University, did psychiatric training in the Caribbean and in Britain, and he has a distinction of being the first academic psychiatrist in the UK of Caribbean extraction, as a senior lecturer and consultant psychiatrist and group psychotherapist at St. George's. He's done some seminal work on suicide in Jamaica, suicide among patients discharged from London psychiatric units, and suicide follow-up of 12 years post-court proceedings. He's also had involvement in what I'll call very important societal issues around New Crossfire tragedy, for instance, and forensic problems in violent offenders, parasuicide in Birmingham, and so on and so forth. And those of you who are familiar with college events will know that Dr. Burke is a seasoned campaigner for justice in all its ramifications. So thank you and welcome, Dr. Burke. It's also my pleasure to welcome 2 eminent professors. First of all, we've got Professor Dawn Edge, who's a professor of mental health and inclusivity at the University of Manchester, Faculty of Biology, Medicine and Health. She has the distinction of being the first and currently only Black woman professor. She's the academic lead for equality, diversity and inclusion, and has a special remit on matters related to race, religion and belief. She's got a passionate desire to eradicate injustice around disparities of access to care and differential outcomes people from Black, African and Caribbean backgrounds and diaspora experience. She's been involved in some significant research, co-creating and evaluating culturally adapted family interventions for Sub-Saharan African and Caribbean descended families in the UK, which is part of the National Institute of Health Research funded program involving the Northwest, the Midlands, London and the southwest of the country. She's also very proud of being an active member of the church, and her faith underpins her philosophy around purposefulness, justice, philanthropy, and a strong desire to make a difference in the world. She enjoys time with family, friends, sports, reading, writing, and gardening. Last and by no means the least is Professor Anton Emmanuel, who's a graduate of London University. He's currently a professor of neurogastroenterology at University College London and a consultant gastroenterologist at University College of National Hospital for Neurology and Neurosurgery, Queen Square. He's the clinical work involved being a director of the GI physiology unit at University College, and his areas of interest are wide. They involve gut neurophysiology, the etiology and management of functional gastrointestinal disorders, management of GI symptoms in neurology and muscular disorders, and so on and so forth. He's an eminent academician, editor-in-chief of Clinical Medicine Commentary, as well as having served as an editorial capacity for Frontline Gastroenterology. He has a deep commitment to developing journals as a valued asset for members of his college. Importantly, he stepped into a role that we know is a significant one for the NHS as the lead for the Workforce Risk Quality Standard in December 2022. In that role, he's moving the focus from the res towards embedding local accountability with organizations for their own data. A key component of res metrics will reflect the individual experience of staff in trusts and systems in order to implement evidence-based actions. On a personal basis, he's the father of 4, an immigrant of African Asian origin, a Londoner, an amateur guitarist, home brewer, and record collector. So you can see we have a fantastic range of experience, but I think the unifying thing is all the commitment to justice and seeing that equitable access to services is something we can all enjoy, irrespective of our complexion. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome you who are listening in. And we've got a question to start the process. It's a long question, but I think the essence of it will be clear. And it goes like this. 2020 was an inflection point with regards to racial justice post George Floyd. Where do you think we are in terms of racism in the workplace in 2021? And I think I would like Dr. Burke to start. Can you hear me?
No, I didn't hear that actually. No.
Did you get that? I'll repeat the question, sir. I said 2020 was an inflection point with regard to racial justice post George Floyd. Where do you think we are in terms of racism in the workplace at the moment? Can you hear me, sir?
Yes, I'm hearing you now.
Yeah, I said the question is 2020 was an inflection point with regard to racial justice post George Floyd. Where do you think personally we are as a country in regards to racism in the workplace?
I've lost it.
Okay, while we're trying to sort that out, can I ask Professor Edge to try and answer the question if she can hear me? And you need to unmute yourself.
Great. Okay. Well, it is a big question. I'd say we're not in a great place, frankly. So the City Mental Health Alliance did a report that found a year on after, as you said, that inflection point, 45% of Black workers have experienced racism at work, with over half of them, 56%, saying that that's negatively impacted their mental health and well-being. And many of you will have read recently the Guardian article where they reported that almost a third of minoritized staff, that's 32.7% of minoritized staff in mental health settings have experienced abuse. And that was based on analysis done by this very college. And, you know, more widely across the NHS workforce, it's 30% of people who have experienced racism. And interestingly, what we have is, on the other side of it, we have British businesses, so senior British business decision makers, when asked about their preparedness, their readiness, their confidence to tackle racial discrimination in the workplace, 8 in 10 of them, actually slightly more, it's 86%, felt that they were ready to tackle racism and discrimination in the workplace. But only 26% had actually taken any steps to implement equality, diversity, and inclusion policies in the workplace. And, you know, the issue is also in terms of trade union representation, really poor in terms of the way people feel that they're being supported in the workplace. And although Black people traditionally had quite, as I'm sure you're all aware on here, challenging experiences with the criminal justice system leading to mistrust, under a Freedom of Information Act by ACAS, the Advisory, Conciliation and Arbitrary Services, they found that there was a 50% increase in employment tribunal cases for race discrimination between 2019 and 2020. And that, I think, just highlights the magnitude of the problems that we face.
Thank you very much, Professor Edge. What you've done there is, by skillful use of statistics, illustrate the dimensions of the continuing nature of this very stubborn problem. So I wonder whether Dr. Burke is able to answer or give us his perspective now before I move to the other two panelists?
Yes, can you hear me?
We can hear you, sir.
Fine, thanks. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here among such a wonderful panel. It's a bit of a problem at one level because we are aware that this issue of racism seems to be about Black people. But it isn't. It's about a whole range of people. And one has to ask, do we need facilitators and opposers, opposition and proposition to really address this issue? George Floyd's passing or killing or murder mirrors very much the very tragic situation which prisoners here, mental patients suffering from mental illness here, youngsters here, and of course this great challenge and the very great horror of Sarah's killing, women here face every day of our life. So now the question for me is, how does one begin to unpack a situation which is charged by virtue of, my grandmother, I was looking at it the other day, was born in 1976, one grandmother. So her parents came out of slavery, just about emancipation. So it's not a long time. And this is a stain on the hands, on the lives, on the tradition, on the good things of Britain. It's a stain. And one shouldn't duck that issue. It's a recent stain, and the stain hasn't been removed in any way. And there's no motivation for it to be removed. I don't think there's any. So the question is, does that make it really difficult for us seeking to mend or attend or repair or enhance the lives of the patients and their families that we're working with? In recent times, I've been most concerned about the issue of playing truant from school. I have never played truant from school, so I don't know what it's like. I wish I had. And I wish I had been a disruptive youngster at school to have been permanently excluded. I can tell you, I've been a disruptive oldster at work, and I have been excluded. And the question is, does it make a difference when you're excluded, or is it the same if you're excluded, repatriated home, deported home, imprisoned, whatever, whether you deserve it or not? Does it make a difference, or is it a harsh reality which one must deal with? Well, youngsters, boys and girls at school who are Black have a higher likelihood of being excluded. And and being excluded in my work actually is a high risk factor for certain psychiatric conditions. But what then happens is that there is a movement within psychiatry to make it seem that those conditions may not exist. So the question is this purposeful or accidental, or is it simply that I haven't come with the information sufficiently clearly in time so that my colleagues and youngsters coming into the trade and psychotherapists and teachers and social workers could then address this issue of how do we minimize a risk factor like permanent exclusion or playing truant? How do we deal with it? On Sunday, it will be World Mental Health Day. I'm a member of a group which is prevention of suicide. How do we prevent these things? So for me, the issue is really that the society we are living in and we are part of, and Jamaica, I'm from Jamaica, we've always been British. We have very small link with Africa. For me, that's a disappointment, but it's a reality. My name, the names we have, the linkages we have, the Irish came before we did in Jamaica, but the reality is very much that we are British. And how then do you deport someone who is British from Britain? How do you do that? How do you repatriate someone to a better fate under a coconut tree or a banana tree, believing he or she will get better there than here? When you know that the situation is grim in those environments because of the history we have. So I think I'm putting forward the view that we are caught in a trap. And the trap is the making of our ancestors. It's the making of the present systems of running things. And it's the making of the reality that perhaps we are, by default, I say, we are people who face exclusion at many a turn. Right, yeah.
Thank you very much for that exposition. I think what I took from that is you widened the circumference of our conversation and grounded the workplace in the context of systematic and systemic issues that have a historical trajectory. So I appreciate that. And you've tried to share with us that the trajectory doesn't start when you get to the workplace. A whole raft of differential issues that assail people of color, not just Black people, right from the get-go. So thank you, and that's really appreciated. I'll now go on to Dr. Bankole to give us her views on the central question, racism in the workplace.
Thank you very much for inviting me to contribute to this. To me, I do agree with Professor Burke and then Professor Hedge with regard to the statistic they've already mentioned. Racism at workplace, to me, is the elephant in the room. And I believe that it is an organizational culture. From my experience, when I moved to the UK, it started very subtle. I think it's becoming more overt now. And there are a lot of instances, there's a lot of examples that I could recollect, I could remember that happened to me in workplace. And then at a point, it's important to sit down and having insight into who you are and what exactly the definition of racism to you or discrimination. Don't get me wrong, I understand that a lot of us coming to this, we need time to acclimatize and all that, and we need different approach to gradually develop. But the most important thing, as I said earlier, is an organizational culture. As psychiatry, from what Professor Hedge has already quoted the statistic, the effect of this racism on mental well-being is important. If we call ourselves psychiatrists, that we treat people, we support our patient, we should be able to support one another. And I know there are situations whereby experiencing this has impact on people's mental health. I know people and I've experienced it myself individually. Now the question is, where do we go from here? Before, and I said it was subtle, but now it's becoming more overt. People are becoming more confident to discriminate and to exercise injustice against people, not only Blacks, really for whatever reason, religious belief, gender and all that. I believe now the way forward in 2021, we need leadership, people with courage and ability to shift that culture, to let people know that we are human beings, people are human beings, and call for humanity, kindness, compassion towards fellow colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think what you've done is bring it to the particulars of individual experience in the context of organizational life. Yeah. And you also said that we also need to be future focused, because something so transformative on people's lives, has systemic consequences, can force us to convene councils of despair. And I think we're here both to acknowledge the difficulties, but to think about what we can do to address it. So it's a good prelude to inviting Professor Emmanuel, whose role as res lead the NHS, and he's said in his bio, his focus is from moving from just numbers, which are important, to grounding in the hard realities of organizational life. So Professor Emmanuel, welcome. What are your views on this question?
Thanks, Tim. Please call me Anton if you're comfortable. I mean, I think the bottom line is the question is, where are we? We are in a terrible place, and we're in a place where the effect of the pandemic didn't level anything. Okay, no black or brown person in this country thinks, oh, what a shock that people were dying in their droves from a BME perspective, especially in the workforce. That was not a surprise. Okay, who was getting access to PPE? Who was getting redeployed first? There was no surprise about any of this stuff. Okay, the people who were surprised were the people who've been complacent for a long time. And we need to be upfront about this. The first thing is, a lot of us have been very quiet. We tend to say, oh, well, I've been lucky. I don't see much racism. Not everyone, but there's been a lot of that culture of, we're inherently tolerant. We're in healthcare where we try to be understanding and compassionate to all this. And, I think we have to, you can be my favorite thing, you have to be an angelic troublemaker. You have to, use the data, put the smile, but you have to be prepared to be disruptive. Because this is, as Professor Burke said, this is an institutionalized thing. So where we are is a terrible place. And I think that picking up what Dr. Bankole was saying, if we're talking about leadership going forward, the problem is that a lot of our leadership are good at saying the words. They've gone on the courses, but they don't have the, whatever it is, the inclination, the skill set, the desire. I'm sure it's not, or it's skill set is an unfair thing to say maybe, to actually impose this. And the problem is that we don't have enough BME people coming through the pipeline to be those leaders. Because this has been so systematized from school days, as Professor Burke was saying, we have this issue where we get stuck. If you look at what happens in the data, our people tend to get stuck at middle grade of every system. And so when it comes to looking for talent opportunities and so on, we get overlooked. So we haven't even got that chance to have the chance to take on leadership with skin in the game. So I think where we are is in a place where we're reaping the fruits of the system for a long time. The big ambition and hope I have is that we're talking about this a bit more. We're prepared to find some white allies who are out there in the system. And then I should also say, just one last thing, is that I'm also not interested in the idea of this being an anti-white thing. This is around the fact we know that the white Gypsy and Romani community have terrible experiences from the res data we're going to be producing this year. Will show that white Europeans have had a lot of abuse and so on. So this is not racial equality is not color dependent. So we're in a bad place because of our systems, and we are intrinsically hamstrung a bit by the fact that our pipeline is dry at the moment.
Thank you very much. I think sobering first go, the summary is there's a large challenge ahead of us. The issues around the courage that we require to carry on the good fights, speak truth to power, the issues about the systemic impediments that stand in the way of people of color, getting their voices heard. And I guess we can kind of move from the particularities of an individual in context to the laws, policies that guide people's access to remedy in the event that they have been wronged. So we've got some questions that I will now pitch to you. One of them is saying, actually, the level of appreciation of racial discrimination among the white majority community is not as high as it should be. Will panelists share their thoughts on how individuals in their context can bring greater awareness to the plight of people who are suffering racial prejudice? And I think there's something around that tension between being a challenger, where you're challenging inequity and injustice, and a negotiator, where you're trying to negotiate better opportunities for people who are from diverse backgrounds. So I'll go to Dr. Bankole first. What are your views on how to get more allyship, more white colleagues to understand the plight of people when they're going through difficult times at work?
From my from my experience, like this type of webinar that we just started, the Black Psychiatry, we need unity. We need an organization and we need a voice whereby we could be able to put this forward to the college about what is going on. I have already been, for the past many years, I've already been thinking or how to go about this. I would be much more, from my opinion, is to look into a pathway, to set up a pathway on how people concerns can be heard. It doesn't matter whether this concern is going to have an outcome, but it is important to give us a voice to be able to speak about what exactly is going on, what is experience, what you're going through. But over the time and many years, people just kept quiet and not able to speak out. When I experienced racism or discrimination, I personally am one of the people, I just kept quiet. I come from a background whereby I'm very bubbly and confident and all that. Experience of racism just shut me up and I lost confidence completely. So I believe, looking back from my experience, if I had opportunity to speak up in my workplace without being victimized, without experiencing for the victim or for the injustice or discrimination, I think it will go a long way. So from that question, I believe we should have a calling point where people can talk, irrespective of whichever trust they are working for.
Thank you very much. I think that's a very salutary kind of exposition of how difficult things can be and how in the attempt to address things that are going bad, you actually invite more problems. And that, I think it behooves organizations to put stronger signposting for people to be able to express concerns in an appropriate manner, timely manner. It doesn't then come at the expense of their mental well-being. So I'll ask Dr. Burke for his thoughts on that question. White allyship, appreciation of the distressed people or racial minority status face at work. Why is it so low that most of the majority population from the question don't appear to appreciate what goes on for their colleagues of color?
There is an issue which is very difficult to tease out. When I worked in Bury St. Edmunds, which is near to Cambridge, there are very few minority population living there. And when I worked in St. Albans, which is not too far from London, again, this was a wonderful period of, it was bliss, really. We didn't have any campaigning to do because the population was mainly English, really. And the staff, they were okay, actually. They were pretty good. We were all together and we did our bit. But when I came to London from Birmingham, Birmingham was a mixture of things, but I was doing research. So I didn't have the task of struggling for, you could say, my people, or the people that one could include or should include in a population subject to inferior circumstances and services. So there are two things. The circumstances are inferior, deprivation is high, and services are matching that. And the system we're working in really reflects very much the system that it is serving. So, you know, there is a problem insofar as the one and the other go together hand in glove. And when I campaigned, I wasn't campaigning. I refute the idea I was campaigning, but when I look back and see that perhaps I was campaigning, the question was, could it have been successful given the fact that it was a terrifying issue to campaign, you would lose everything. I have examples of losing quite a lot. And the question is it worth losing a lot during your early adult life for a group ill-defined and at the mercy of the state? So the question really is, should a group of individuals who've come to Britain could be from Poland, could be from wherever, be left to campaign for themselves?
Are you still, you cut out for a bit there.
Sorry?
You cut out. Had you finished? You stopped for a bit. We wonder you took a pause or you'd stopped.
Yeah. It's the internet connection. I don't know why it's like that.
Okay.
So I'm saying the question is, why campaign? For whom, for what, and against whom? Why campaign? And I think the issues are very difficult now because morale in the country has been dented to a large extent by COVID. Services are suffering in a general way. There is insecurity in all sorts of areas, women in particular with the killing of Sarah. We are at a turning point, and it will be important for us to consider carefully, very carefully, what we do at this turning point and how we operate. I think it's a very, very good thing that there is a movement coming out of George Floyd, which allows us to reflect on the issues ahead of us and immediately with us now. There's no easy solution, but what we do know is that youngsters and those in need because of social circumstances or medical circumstances or psychological circumstances need support.
Thank you very much. I think what you've done again is lay open the complexities and the kind of intersectional nature of some of the challenges we're describing. I'm going to ask Anton now to give us his views on the central tension between a person experiencing discriminatory behavior to the detriment of their well-being at work, but not feeling sufficient credence given by ethnic majority colleagues. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, for me, there's again tended to be a sticking plaster solution to this. So the latest version is, and I'm not trying to disparage something, although I understand very critical, like the Freedom to Speak Up movement and the Guardians there, that may work for some people. But what is really important is that it's not a solution for everyone. A lot of people of any ethnicity, but also by disability and so on, don't feel comfortable talking to somebody, maybe their senior, maybe a different gender, whatever. So I think we have to be respectful that these solutions don't work. And ultimately, that thing, you have to have somebody who's independent. You can't have somebody who you're complaining to, if you want to speak up freely, who's then going to have a direct link for their position to the board or something like that. So I think there needs to be a subtlety about it. So the question about allyship is a really important one, because I think, again, recognizing that this is, I don't want to say white allyship, because as I say, lots of white staff also experience discrimination, and that's absolutely not what we're interested in perpetuating. It's allyship for people who, and the flip side of this thing about this privilege, and one of the things we get the most complaints about into the res inbox is the idea that we're assuming people have privilege, and I think that's a misunderstanding, as all of us on this call will know, I guess. I won't labor it, but privilege isn't saying that you're walking around with a spoon in your mouth and everything is gracious. It's just saying that you're blind to the fact that you don't have to overcome certain hurdles. And it's that thing that I think if we're trying to create allies, it's about trying to help them understand, look, a disciplinary process, I think Dawn was playing this earlier on, isn't just another number. It isn't just somebody who's in a statistic. This is, you think about the horror that goes through your soul when you see a GMC letter the letters FTP, you think, oh my God, it runs through your blood. And that is a human being. And what is the process we went through before we went through that, put that person through? Was there a review? Was there a review of the person's individual situation? Was there a process of a panel to go through that? It's those things we just need to make our allies understand the experience. And so I think when you have colleagues who, we don't ask them to speak for us, we ask them to listen, take their ears off to listen to our stuff, which is beyond their privilege, and then allow us to have our voice be something which mirrors these numbers. So these numbers are always abstract as somebody else. We need to hear this. And I think that's the part we don't get quite right yet as BME people. We tend to say, look, here's the data, come on, you guys, you're in charge, do it. And I think that's a mistake on our part. We need to be activists in an intelligent way.
Thank you very much. I think what you've said is very clear. There's something about galvanizing common accord and challenging the status quo in a way that is both transformative, determinative, and probably tactically astute. And I think part and parcel of sharing intelligence is finding new ways of doing things that are challenging to better effect. So I'll now pass on to Professor Edge. Your thoughts about that central question.
Yeah.
Allyship, how far can we push this envelope to get better recognition of disadvantage based on prejudicial experiences?
So I just want to pick up a couple of things that have been said already. And one of the things I heard in the immediate aftermath of George Floyd was the number of Black, Asian, so minoritized communities, racialized communities, people who talked about being tired. And that we're tired for a reason. And that's because so often the solutions are required of us for the problems that we face. People looking for us to do the training, to educate people, to tell them what to do. And yet we know a lot of this stuff. Anton mentioned the data. Well, actually, we're not been the people producing a lot of that data. The stuff from the GMC about not just the disproportionate rates at which people from minoritized communities are disciplined. It's the same NMC. It's as Dr. Burke was alluding to earlier on, this is a systemic problem. And we've seen the data, and they know the data, and they've been looking at those data for decades, but not a great deal's done about them. And people do hear people's voice. People do speak. And I think Dr. Bankole is absolutely right. There's a reason why people withdraw and become silent. It's because of the fear of the repercussions. So when people are in those disciplinary meetings and they do speak, they do talk about their experiences. And indeed, in the process before that, when people are complaining about what's happening with them in their workforce, they're often not heard in terms of being really heard and listened to. They experience disbelief, couldn't really have happened like that, gaslighting, these really negative things. And I noticed somebody put in the chat something about what is euphemistically called microaggressions. So those things that happen to people, which is really difficult to articulate, really difficult. The way people treat you in a particular environment, you're the only Black member of staff, and people are in the staff room and they're having a laugh and a joke, and you walk in and everybody goes silent, and you never get invited to different things, and they're seen really small and trivial and inconsequential. But what they do is they create an environment in which certain people feel excluded, and an environment in which those people whose behavior is prejudicial, discriminatory, or overtly or covertly racist can flourish. Because what then happens is when people start to say about how they've been impacted by the joke, just a bit of banter. I didn't really mean it, didn't mean any harm. Oh, come on, you need to get a bit more thicker skin, without recognizing at all the cumulative effect of that. And as Dr. Bankole talked about, the emanating effect of that in terms of people's self-confidence. And you're then the consultant, you've been treated like this, maybe by one of your colleagues, by a service user, family member who doesn't want you to work with them because of the color of your skin. And that happens in front of all your colleagues and nobody speaks up. And you've then still got to have that professional persona and, you know, believe that people see you as an equal. And that is hard work. It's a burden, and it makes people tired, and it makes us sick. There's really good evidence that the impact is not just in terms of our mental health, but in terms of our physical health and well-being also. So I, for one, I'm more than happy to work alongside people who want to work with me. But as for me being the educator, I think we're past that now. I think people have to educate themselves, or at least be really, really willing to work alongside people and learn together. Because, yeah, I'm for one, I'm tired of carrying the burden.
Thank you very much. That's a very pungent riposte to the notion that we have to bear the burden of being recipients on one hand of disadvantage, at the same time being the kind of liberators in terms of educating people. Now, there's an interesting issue about deep canvassing, which can come back and look in terms of approaches to making that burden a bit less from the perspective of people of color. But next question we have on the system, and I'm mindful of time, we've got about 18 minutes left, and we have to summarize towards the end. So I'm assuming people could just make more succinct submissions. The key thing and question is, what do you think about the ongoing disproportionate representation of IMGs, GMC disciplinary hearings? And I'll start with Anton this time.
So what do I make of it? I make of it that it's that we have systems in place which allow this to happen. We have organizations which don't have a review process. They don't do a root cause analysis. They'll see you. And there's an impression of what a doctor looks like, or what a doctor sounds like. One of the things we're picking up is accent makes a difference. I came to this country from Nigeria when I was 12. I quickly learned that my West African accent was an impediment. Okay, so as a teenager, a 12-year-old, I learned to put this thing on, this accent on. And, you know, people hear a black or a brown person speak with their native accent and say, oh, they can't be quite as good as that person who's 10 years their junior, because they sound and they look like what my head says. And therefore, then they're more inclined to do something which is to be unhappy and not to liking your advice, and you were too direct, and he was a bit angry, and he flashed his eyes at me, and she didn't really listen, and she didn't look at me. Not that it's culturally sensitive for us. There's all these things where, you know, taking Coles to Newcastle, as psychiatrists, you guys are incredibly experienced at putting the cultural perspective into somebody's presentation, but there's a reciprocity that as the professionals that not everyone affords us. We expect it to be that sort of, you know, just another slice of the same cake. We're just exactly the same, and we're not. So that's what happens. What I also find is that the processes within the GMC are not good, where there's a similar sort of advocacy there, which is lacking. And that comes out from all the data, and they're more likely to take on cases and pursue them with BME people, especially in the SAS grades and the LED grades. And so what we're trying to do in terms of taking about action must be positive. This is Black History Month, where we celebrate things as much as, or more than we do have our problems. This is that we're going to basically identify the heat map. Where are the organizations where this is happening? Where are the deaneries where this is happening? Let's identify that. Let's publish that. Let's make it clear so that trainees have a choice. I said, up within the reason. Say, oh, okay, that's going to help me, inform me. I'll go to that job rather than this one. That's how we do it. So and then by doing that, then we'll change places and think, oh God, if they suddenly see people voting with their feet, that's one way of doing it.
Yeah. Thank you. I think what Anton was illustrating there was the power of exposure in the sense of making very clear where problems exist and allowing people to make decisions based on clear-headed evaluation of the evidence in front of them. And it seems that statistics can be used as just, how do I put it, addressing expectations and gaming the numbers, or it can be used to interrogate quite clearly and rigorously how well organizations are doing. And we know across the NHS, there are some organizations that are doing things better than others, but doesn't allow for complacency, because overall, we're probably not doing as well as we could or should be doing. So with that in mind, I'll go to Dr. Burke to just give us some thoughts about essentially IMGs disproportionately found to be facing disciplinary measures at the GMC. What are your thoughts about that? What can be done different to make that less likely? Can't hear you. You're mute.
Yeah, thank you. I've been associated with the GMC for many years in a role of assisting doctors. And I've been aware of the difficulties the GMC faces. And it's tried, but the question is, can you really get very far if the other institutions of state, the judiciary, it's a regulator, and the question is the regulator free? I think it's free up to a point, but in 1984, I think, or 83, a colleague of mine, Professor Joe Collier, and myself, we found that the system of admitting students to medical schools was biased, and that women and non-whites were not being allowed in the same way. So we exposed it. And the British Medical Journal had a whole set of things about a blot on the profession. Well, my boss, said in a closed meeting, which I then heard the content, he's not going to get anywhere, that chap Burke. That's many years ago. But round about the same time, we published a journal, Racism and Mental Illness, following a conference on racism and mental illness. And the effort going into that was massive. But we had to close down because the system that we knew exists, the system we operate within, didn't want it. So we're coming back now 37 years later, we sort of digging it up and saying, well, why did we not get anywhere in 37 years? Or have we got somewhere? I think the country depends on migrants and continues to treat migrants as second-rate citizens. That's a problem. But it is how the country is run. So the question for me in psychiatry and in medicine as a whole, and in all the helping professions, particularly social work, where, and education, these are massive areas of input. Is it there that it's happening at the early stages? And are we at the wrong place, the GMC? The GMC is important, I agree, but is it happening at such a difficult level as children in the cradle that it's not going to change? I don't know. I think we shouldn't give up. But the GMC, I'm not defending them, but I think they have tried. I think they have attempted to make things work, but the reality is the GMC is in Britain, and Britain isn't ready for that measure of change. It really isn't ready for that change, in my view.
Thank you very much. That's a very clear view. Professor Edge.
So I guess if the question is, what can we do? I think I'd like to move us on, Bill, what Dr. Burke is saying, to what can we do? So we know, for example, that there are a number of standards. So most of us will be aware of the workforce race equality standard. Yes. So the RES has been around for a while, and I think it's 2016, and yet we still find that white applicants are significantly more likely to be appointed from shortlisting compared to non-whites. and that non-white staff are much more likely to be disciplined. And when they are disciplined, the penalties are much more severe compared with white colleagues. And according to the last res, there was, in terms of the perceptions of bullying, discrimination and harassment and abuse, both black and white, BAME, so non-white and white staff, said that that hadn't actually improved. If anything, things were getting worse. So we have some systems in place, but they don't seem to be working very well. And so, you know, getting policies and guidelines and stuff in place is one thing. But I think Dr. Burke has hit the nail on the head when we're talking about this is a systemic problem. And I'm not being defeatist and saying we can't change anything, but we need to be clear about the scale of the problem and to be really honest about our willingness to change. So, for example, we've had the Workforce Race Equality Standard, and you know, it's a fantastic tool for changing the way things are done, because you know, it shines a light on how people are being treated. And now we're having a new one. We've got the Civility and Respect Toolkit. And that subtle shift from focusing on race, discrimination. So the language has changed. There's no prejudice used in it. The language has shifted, and now it's all about being civil. And so now we'd move from microaggressions, which I find problematic anyway, to now micro incivilities, and and the language changes, but the impact for the people whose lives are still disproportionately negatively impact is the same. But all that happens is that it's more difficult to express that and to have any kind of redress.
Sorry, Dr. Bankole, we got about 7 minutes. Sorry but the topics are so challenging that people need to express themselves. So I'd be obliged if I stop you, forgive me, I have some final comments to make, but please tell us what you think about GMC, disproportionate IMG representation.
To be honest, I don't have much to say. Just like what Emmanuel said, it's okay for us to come together and talk about our pain. I think we all know that change is the most difficult thing to achieve. It will be important that if we have a kind of forums whereby we could celebrate success, people who have gone through difficulty with GMC and come out with positive outcome. We have a lot of data, but there are data out there of people who have succeeded, or people who have developed resilience, people who have gone through a lot of difficulty, racism, whereby they can come together and share that success, not only coming together to talk about pain or difficulties and all that. Let us celebrate this success that each and everybody have encountered. And that's all. That's my contribution. It would be nice to give hope out there. There are positive outcome as well.
Thank you very, very much to all the panelists. We tried to deal with a very complex, historically significant, ongoing world global challenge. And definitely 1 hour is inadequate to deal with it in all its complexity. But at least we opened up without shying away from the nature of the problem, but also being hopeful and optimistic about the courage and redoubled effort required to attack the issue. The college on its part is trying to look at developing guidance on tackling racism in the workplace. And some of the conversations we've had here will feed into streams of work. I think that talking about race or racism can sometimes be, as I said, a counsel of despair. But what I picked up from what we're saying is that there is appetite for the fight ahead. There's requirement for us to redouble our efforts, but to be more tactical, to use what we know now. And as I said, going back to that notion of an inflection point, it wasn't just about a poor black man under the knee of a white man. That is about recalibrating our focus, saying actually these things have been going on for too long and it's not right. It's never been right, but it's not right. And to see it so visually exposed to the world, for the first time, it was not uncommon for black, white, yellow, green people to stand up and say that was wrong. And I guess the energy might be dissipating a bit because of COVID and all that, but conversations that previously weren't possible even a year ago can be had now. Not necessarily comfortably, but they're beginning to be had now. And that's what we have to invest a lot of hope in. So we're going to be chucked out of this in 4 minutes, but I'll just say if there's any one last comment that any panelist wants to make, we'll be happy to hear that. And if you get chucked out, it's not my fault. Apparently the timer is an hour. So but at least we said thank you for your wisdom. Any further comments? I'll start with Dr. Burke. Anything quickly?
I do feel that it's counterproductive for us to make it seem that there's Black consensus among the Black group that we are. There isn't. I think that we have to find ways of outreaching, and outreaching will require some give and take from the medical institution, including the GMC, the BMJ, the British Medical Association, and other groups. We are at a turning point, and the society needs some sort of solution to a grim situation in medicine and social care. That's my view.
Thank you. Professor Edge?
Sorry, I don't know that I can follow that. I just think, to echo Dr. Bankole, I want us to be positive and hopeful. You know, I think as a people, we've had to be positive and hopeful to survive. But it's time now for us all, collectively, allies and everybody else, to come and say, right, what are we actually going to do that's going to change things? Not the time for just talking and more policies and stuff is long gone. We actually need to see real change with that are measurable differences that we can actually point to, so that our children and our children's children don't have to be on here in however many years having the same seminar.
Thank you very much. Dr. Bankole?
I don't have much to say. I believe in humanity. I'm just calling on every one of us to come together. I believe in unity, and with unity, we can do it. It's not going to go away, but there's a room for improvement.
Thank you very much. And final word to Anton.
For me, the future means leaders taking accountability for this, holding themselves so it's in their appraisals. EDI should not be an optional extra. It should be hardwired into their system. CQC taking this seriously, not giving outstanding well-leds for places which have appalling data. You know, it's about individual organizations taking responsibility and the leaders within those organizations caring enough about their work, their staff, because the thing that we keep saying, and we just had to drum in, is that this is not about making a few BME people feel better. It's because the outcomes of patients are reflected in that. So it's not just about treating your staff well, it's treating your patients well. It should be as important as your finances, as your patient safety events, as your cancer weights. This EDI stuff is not an optional extra. It's not icing on the cake, it's the cake.
Thank you very much. So now falls on me to bring this webinar to a close. Thank you, Dr. Burke. Thank you, Professor Edge. Thank you, Anton, and thank you, Bankole. It's been a privilege sharing this hour with you. And thank you to people watching the webinars. Take care of yourselves and either travel home safely, keep safe. Thank you. Goodbye.